we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Antonia Fasanelli. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today, especially after such a dynamic panel this morning already, and we're going to be picking up that conversation right where they left off. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to start by inviting my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump right in. So Clarence, would you like to start right at the end?
On this end.
Yeah, sure.
Good morning. How is everyone doing? Clarence Wardell. What are we just telling? So currently a senior program officer at the Gates Foundation, working on our economic mobility and opportunity team. But prior to that, most recently was in the Biden-Harris administration for the first 2 years. Both served with the Domestic Policy Council as a senior advisor for policy implementation and delivery there, as well as our chief data and equity officer for the American Rescue Plan implementation team. Really happy to be with you.
Hi, everyone. So great to follow this most recent panel on guaranteed income. I'm Halah Ahmad. I am the VP for Policy at the Jain Family Institute, an organization that specializes in guaranteed income research.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here as well. Jeremy Rosen, Director of the Economic Justice Team at the Shriver Center on Poverty Law in Chicago.
And I'm Antonia Fasanelli. I'm Executive Director at the National Homelessness Law Center, and I'm a co-chair of the section on Civil Rights and Social Justice's Economic Justice Committee. And I'm really delighted to pick up the conversation right where our first panel left off. We're going to be covering a great deal about how to move guaranteed income programs from pilot programs to sustainable policy. And we heard so much already this morning about some of the critical advocacy approaches we need to undertake to be able to bring these programs from pilot to permanent policy. Talked a lot about narrative change and some of the data that already exists, analyzing the pilots that have been around for some time. So I'm going to jump in right here and invite my colleague Halah on the panel to talk about some of the gaps in data that exist at the moment, so we can think about some of the areas we need to cover as we start to put together our advocacy campaign. So Halah, go ahead.
So tell me if I have to move this mic like this or fine. Can everybody hear me? A little closer. Okay, got it. So, you know, picking up on the last panel, a lot of the ways that we think about pilots to policy has to do with the research that pilots are engaging in. And Tiffany from MGI spoke to that a little bit. But there's this dual component to the pilots where they are, first of all, providing people money, which is great, and improving people's lives materially in a way that they decide on what they spend on and meet their own needs by their own terms. And through that, there's a work around narrative that some of the panelists spoke to, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the second component is this research agenda. Now, how much can you learn from a pilot that's offering cash $500 a month to 25 individuals? How much can you learn from a pilot that's targeted to one particular group? Well, it turns out there's a lot that we can learn about people's perceptions of guaranteed income from these pilot initiatives. But what Tiffany alluded to as well in the last panel, and hopefully I'll repeat a little bit in case there's new folks in the room or on Zoom, is we've had decades of research on cash assistance policy to rely on, even before the recent wave of guaranteed income programs across the country. And that research tells us that people largely keep their jobs when they're receiving cash assistance, and they spend on what they need largely. What we don't know is what does it take, what type of policy design will move us from $500 a month in Mississippi or $1,000 a month in DC to a group of people to a national level policy similar to the child tax credit, which was the largest guaranteed income program ever implemented at the national level. So part of the questions that we're answering in that vein is, okay, what is the right amount that we are going to give to folks? Does it matter if it's $400 versus $500? Do the effects dramatically shift when you move from that number to the latter? Do you need a certain threshold to meet the kinds of effects that we're looking for? Income smoothing, a buffer for families, wealth building, very different. These are very different goals. If you're targeting poverty, what is the right amount and right targeting target group in order to achieve the highest number when you're looking at poverty impacts? With the child tax credit, one of the biggest innovations, and Clarence will talk a little bit more about this as well, was that it was reaching people at $0 in income. That meant that you're substantially lifting families' incomes from the bottom. For folks who are on that threshold poverty line, you're lifting them above that number. So, over 3 million children were lifted out of poverty in the past year through the child tax credit is the data that we are seeing. But the research questions that we're seeing around pilots has to do with what do we know about why guaranteed income is effective for the smaller scale pilots, thinking about the qualitative elements. And on the quantitative side, thinking about how can we look at the more precise impacts in varying the design parameters, varying amounts, varying frequencies. Should people receive it once a month? Should they receive it every 2 weeks? Should they receive it once a year? What are the different impacts that you see in that design choice, and translating those learnings over to policy design? So there are a few pilots that are working on this. All across the board, all of the pilots will contribute to a broader knowledge base of how guaranteed income works in the United States, which is important because there's a lot of research on guaranteed income in international context, but we need to know what it looks like here before we can implement it here. But there are pilots working on a combination of worker support and job training, plus guaranteed income. There are pilots that are focused on providing varying amounts and frequencies at scale. So you have a randomized controlled trial design that allows you to see, okay, what difference does that make in our impacts? And best example of that I can think of offhand is the Compton Pledge. My bias, JFI is the design and implementation partner of that program, and working on the research. So there are a few opportunities for further research and a few open questions, but I think what's really important about the pilot design questions right now is thinking about what are the open questions when it comes to long-term policy that we can incorporate into the design components of the pilot, while also prioritizing the needs of the communities and their asks around what the design should be and the targeting should be in their communities.
So I just want to pick up on and sort of build on that point just a little bit. I really couldn't agree more that the key question for research right now is how to inform program design versus sort of what we were talking about earlier or on the earlier panel, which is thinking about the questions of narrative, which I know we'll get into more later on this panel. I don't think we need more research to show the world that if low-income people have more cash in their pockets, they do better. I think it's program design, figuring out the most efficient way to get the most cash assistance to the most people, and in the most effective ways. That's where we need the research. I come at this a little bit from thinking about our work in Illinois, where we have a pilot program that is being researched at the city of Chicago. We have one in Cook County. Our state is about to adopt a pilot program serving homeless families, and we're looking at state child tax credit creation in order to start thinking about using tax policy to provide essentially a guaranteed income to the lowest income families in the state. So we're looking at this at all levels of government in Illinois. And as I talk to policymakers, while some might say, do we have the money? And then we have to have those conversations about budget priorities and things like that. Nobody is really saying we don't believe that if we give low income people more cash assistance, that will be beneficial for them. They are saying, what is the best way to do it? What should programs look like? What should our funding sources be, and what kind of, what is the most effective way to make sure we're doing the most good with whatever resources we have?
Could I also add to that a little bit? I just want to offer just a kind of the flip side of that and what we can learn. I reeled off probably two interesting, weird titles for folks in my role in the administration. So DPC, Policy Implementation and Delivery Advisor to Ambassador Rice, and then Chief Data and Equity Officer for ARP Implementation. Both points exactly right. I just want to offer the other thing that is imperative for us to learn from these and that we should learn is around the implementation side. I think we can design the most beautiful, elegant policy that we could ever imagine. We saw this with the Affordable Care Act. We were, a huge policy breakthrough. It didn't deliver the benefits to people as quickly as we wanted to because of the policy design didn't incorporate some of the implementation pieces early enough. And so we were trying to work on the implementation side to fill that in on the back end to get those resources to people. And so I think similarly here, especially as we see governments kind of moving into the space and CBOs as well, understanding what works and what doesn't work in terms of reaching people who are most in need of these resources. How do we get those checks into their bank account? Or if they don't have a bank account, how do we get them a bank account? And how do we get money moving to those with the least resources and disconnected from government? And we'll get into this later. We learned a lot kind of on the CTC side, but I just want to, I think we have to, and we learned a lot in the Obama administration, but move towards this nexus of thinking about both the policy design and the implementation along the same timeline.
Absolutely. And in fact, let's jump into it right now. So we're so excited to have Clarence here, who really worked on ARP implementation. And we've talked a little bit about child tax credit. Clarence, you've kindly offered to cover some basics about what that expanded child tax credit looked like and what some of the lessons are that you learned from the challenges of implementation. So
yeah, sure.
go right ahead.
Happy to touch on it a bit. I know, I heard Peter here was talking about the child tax credit earlier. Some other folks are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, American Rescue Plan, which we touched on earlier, provided a whole host of benefits across a number of programs, some for the first time ever. CTC was an existing tax credit, but it was very novel in what ARP did to expand the reach of that credit. Halah mentioned for the first time, it was fully refundable, and it was eligible for people who were below who didn't make enough income in a year previously to even file taxes, and so those folks were now newly eligible. It expanded the credit from $2,000 to $3,000 for families or for children ages 6 to 17, also making 17-year-olds eligible. And then expanded it $3,600 for children 6 and under for a year. It also made, for the first time, those credits were eligible to be paid in advance, so you could get a monthly check in your bank account for at least the half year of 2021, and then the other half of the credit came once you filed in 2022. And so we saw kind of a drastic expansion on who was eligible. I think the families of some 26 million children were now newly eligible for the first time. Half of those were Black and Hispanic. I think the numbers, and we've seen the Columbia University study and others, the greatest reduction in poverty that we've ever seen, right, in terms of being able to tie that back to one policy intervention. And so from a policy level, macro level, it was I would say, a huge success in driving the outcomes that we would want to see. We'll get into some of the narrative pieces and why it wasn't renewed and what we can all do, I think, to maybe push for that. The other side, I just want to come back to this implementation piece, though. We knew that this would be a big lift in front of us, on some hand. And so this was a fairly regressive policy before, in that, as we talked about, you had to at least file taxes to get this. And then as you progressed up, families who need it or not, but like we're more well off, we're actually getting the credit than those who didn't need it. So the expansion, so immediately, right, we know that there's a tranche of families who were not part of the IRS system, that we didn't have data on, that we had not, you know, in some cases, the government hadn't reached before. We knew coming into this that there were families who were eligible for 3 stimulus checks at that point who hadn't claimed them, right? And so that's, you know, free money, folks who had not, you know, signed up and weren't on the roll somewhere. And so we knew that it would be a pretty big effort to try to reach those families. And so, you know, we did a few things, you know, one that you could do through the legislation and through some rulemaking and policy decisions on the implementation side. You know, so we made it eligible for families who had already applied for the stimulus checks, and we had their information. You didn't need to do anything; it would just show up in your bank account. We then launched with the IRS a simplified non-filer tool, and so this allows people not to go through the process. You know, so we had to get some information on you, but it allowed people not to go through the process of filing a full tax return, right? So just enough information, so to lower the barriers and administrative burden, just enough information to get people on the roll. And then with that, Jain Sperling, who was the ARP coordinator, kind of led both a whole of government, and I would say really a whole of community and whole of nation effort. You know, I know some folks here were involved in some of those conversations to really just kind of all hands on deck. You know, where are these folks, you know, in your communities? How do we reach them? Is it texting? Is it trusted navigators? You know, and really just try to get the word out to folks that, hey, they were eligible for this, and then make it as easy as possible. We work with folks like Code for America to launch getctc.org. We on the White House side launched childtaxcredit.gov, both English and Spanish, to just try to get information out about these. And so all that said, I'm still not confident in any way that we reached those. You know, I think there was a significant chunk of folks who, you know, for whatever reasons, and I think a big piece of it is trust of government, you know, just didn't want their information and didn't want to be found. And so I think that's a little bit tragic in the sense of, you know, those are often the folks who could, you know, most benefit from those resources. And so I would just say, you know, we learned a lot. We learned a lot on the implementation side. We learned a lot on the benefit side of this, but there's still a whole lot more work to be done.
And thank you so much. We're so glad to have your expertise on it. Halah, you want to jump in right there?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about what we learned from the child tax credit implementation last year, which, I mean, I smile when you're going back through the details, just thinking about this incredible program that we implemented through the American Rescue Plan, and how we said, we're going to give parents the money to spend on what they need. And we're going to give it to them in a time where prices are rising, and there's still fear around a global pandemic and economic precarity that came with that. And I think one of the pieces that we see continuing on from the child tax credit, okay, it's stalled on the federal level for reasons Peter mentioned a little bit earlier. But you know, we are seeing some interest in the state level versions of a child tax credit to expand those programs to reach folks who are below the income phase-in for typical programs like their earned income credit or earned income tax credit at the federal level. And that comes directly from inspiration from the federal implementation. My colleague and I in the room, Jack Landry over here, have spoken with state legislators across the country who've been talking about child tax credits. And one example stands out to me. In Vermont, there's a representative, Janet Ansel, who introduced a child tax credit, which passed in the past year, to reach people at $0 in income, again, removing that income phase-in. And her story of inspiration came from, first of all, seeing the dramatic effects on poverty that the CTC had, reducing food insufficiency and, of course, reducing poverty, because when you give people money, their incomes go up, and so they, you know, are materially better off, and you reduce poverty. That's probably the most straightforward outcome. But she harkened back to being a social worker 40 years before she was a state representative, when she was, you know, told to provide all sorts of wraparound services and counseling, and you know, talk to folks that she was providing services for about, you know, how they could manage their money better. And she just kept coming across this reality that what they lacked was cash. They lacked income. And even if they had an income, it wasn't enough, and it probably wasn't enough if an emergency came up. And I'm not talking about national level emergencies. I'm talking about household level emergencies, which are a little bit harder to predict. So that inspiration followed through and came to a fore again when it was implemented at the national level, and we saw this really robust program happening in Vermont. And you're seeing that in multiple other states. New Mexico is a really great example. New Jersey is another example. There are efforts in Illinois that Jeremy could tell you a little bit more about. Colorado, although a little bit more limited because they were banking on the ARP being renewed. There are a few states, but that's one of the pieces that we see as a knock-on effect of the child tax credit. But there's another piece that we also know, and my colleagues in the guaranteed income states in the previous panel also alluded to this. We need the scale of the federal government to implement these programs at a size and amounts and at a scale that can really have an impact. State budgets are much more limited, especially in certain states, are much more limited than the federal government, of course. In the long term, states are hoping that this is a proof of concept, this is an addition, but it doesn't preclude the national conversation continuing on the child tax credit as folks learn that actually I can expect for my government to provide this support. There's a few other lessons from the child tax credit, but I'm sure we're going to get into it. And I don't want to stop Jeremy from chiming in as well, some of the lessons in Illinois.
Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to build on that. So the work we're doing in Illinois is really sort of what I would call kind of a long-term sort of proof of concept work, and thinking really, recognizing that we do at the end of the day have to get to the federal level and have a permanent program that provides a more significant amount of money to families than states are able to do, but also recognizing that states and localities, frankly, do have one advantage, which is generally the ability to get things done when there's a will to do them a little more quickly than here in Washington. I lobbied on the Hill for about 20 years, and I now do lobbying at the state level in Illinois. And you could certainly see the difference in how quickly folks are willing to move when there's a will and ability and a path to do it. So the way we've thought about this in Illinois is sort of as a multi-year plan. We started thinking about using funds from the COVID relief dollars, American Rescue Plan funds that were used to fund guaranteed income programs in Chicago and Cook County. Cook County, Illinois has gotten so excited about their program that they are now actually going to move towards a permanent program. And by permanent, their definition is not necessarily that the same group of folks would permanently receive cash assistance, but that the program would be funded through a permanent funding source. And in their case, they are targeting funds from cannabis taxes that are coming into the county after Illinois legalized cannabis use a few years ago. And so there's tax revenue that comes to the state, the city, and local government, which is probably going to be used as a funding source here. And then we have kind of a multi-year state tax plan effort. And one thing that I want to note that states can do, at least where there's a will to do them in more blue states, is to think about including everybody in these programs. So one thing I want to note about the CTC, and this is not Clarence's fault, this is our fine friends across the hill at the US Congress, but there were populations excluded from that relief. Folks who are undocumented, but file taxes using what's called an individual taxpayer ID number, some mixed status families, other folks. And so what we've thought about in dealing with tax policy at the state level in Illinois, we sort of run a campaign along with our big state immigrant refugee rights coalition to say everybody in. Any tax policy we have in Illinois is going to apply to everyone, including families who are undocumented, and mixed status families and other folks who missed out on federal relief, not just for the sort of bureaucratic reasons and the challenges of reaching people that Clarence described, but because the federal government just didn't cover them in their program.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Clarence, one of the things you've shared is that in the ARP implementation around the child tax credit, that there was a really concerted effort at equity, although limited by the federal guidelines. And I wonder if you could speak to that. I believe you said you had an equity implementation committee. If you could just speak to the structure there and how you use that.
Yeah, happy to. So, I should just say kind of macro picture, if folks may or may not be aware, right? On day one of the Biden administration, the president issued an executive order on advancing racial justice and equity for underserved communities through the federal government. That laid out a whole host of really kind of like, if you were to think about a company, organizational kind of policy initiatives and efforts to just kind of level up the federal government and how it does business and how it thinks about the policies and the work that it does and where there are opportunities to do better. We know that historically there have been intentional policy and implementation decisions that have been made to exclude vast swaths of Americans. And so, I think where there has been intentionality there, this was a focus to say we need to be intentional moving forward about how we're structuring our work and being inclusive. So there are quite a few things within that, and we can touch on a few of those. Alongside that, so that was day one, and about 2 months after that, ARP passes, and the president tapped Jain to serve as the ARP implementation coordinator. And one thing the president kind of indicated to Jain, and that I know Jain is very passionate about, was that this $1.9 trillion, a historic sum of money that was going into things like CTC, SBA community navigators, $350 billion into 30,000 communities across the country, something on the scale that we have never done before. A whole range of programs. And so what is our responsibility in the context of this NGO to ensure that we aren't, and where a lot of these implementation efforts usually focus is through in the now president, who was the vice president, ran our program, is program integrity. And that's where we end up with a lot of the administrative burdens that come with these programs, is where folks are so concerned that, my God, if one person gets this, it's not meant to get it. That is somehow a big travesty. Never really balancing on the other side how big a travesty it is, for folks who are eligible for it, not to actually have received it. And so we really wanted to, obviously we were very focused and saw all sorts of things and stories written around kind of pandemic, waste, fraud, and abuse, and some of the scams that were ran there. But from our focus too, it was, are we doing as much as we can to get the resources to people in these communities? And so, that was kind of my job, and it was, kind of in the context of all of this. The strength was that we had the president kind of in this executive order behind us to say, from the top, how are we thinking about these programs? And so for each of these programs, we had a set of kind of almost a checklist of things that we wanted to go through, both on, implementation is kind of two pieces here, right? There's the legislation that's set. There's still a whole bunch of policy making that's done on the executive side once that implementation is passed, right? So there's kind of these, I would just say, like micro decisions that do actually move the needle very much so. The simplified filing tool, that was not in the legislation. That was a decision that had to be made in conversation with the IRS, Treasury, the White House to open that up. For us, that was a big equity decision, right? But then there are things like, what else can we do using the bully pulpit to raise awareness, increase access to these programs, and how can we convene others who are thinking about this. And so for each of these programs, we kind of had a bit of that checklist and how we thought through it. I'll do a little bit of a plug in my kind of ongoing cheat sheet. In May of last year, we released, this is the executive summary, so 60 pages. It's a 300-page report that we released on advancing equity through the American Rescue Plan that talks about the 30+ programs, how we did that. And then in CTC in particular, you know, we knew going in that that we were going to be missing a huge swath of the population. I would just say one other piece in the executive order was where the president established an equitable data working group. And so this was a recognition that for all the things that we want to do on advancing equity, we can't do that if we don't have the data to understand who is benefiting from what and how are we serving folks. And not just better quality data, but in many cases we were missing data. And this is, and we touched on this before, but this was an area where we just knew that we just had huge blind spots on who was eligible for this and actually where they were at. And so we had kind of ongoing working groups, both with, and you know, there's legal restrictions on what information can be shared from the IRS and in what form. But the IRS early on released its estimates at the zip code level of where folks were around the country who might be eligible for this, but hadn't, you know, were not in the system already. So we made that available to community groups, and it was our hope that could help with some of the organizing on the ground there. So there's kind of a range of things that we did around that, and you know, happy to go into further detail on any of those.
Fantastic. I'm going to let you hold up the cover of that book again, just so everyone can see it. As we move into talk a little bit more about how child tax credit policy, be it the federal program, which Halah described accurately as the largest guaranteed income program in the country, or state level CTCs. There's an effort to pass one in Maryland in the state legislature right now this year. That in fact, Robin McKinney, who couldn't be at the previous panel, is part of that advocacy effort. Halah, could you just speak to a little bit to the extent the child tax credit policy concept has provided a push to guaranteed income or hasn't? Are those connections being made with state legislators?
Yeah, this is a complicated question. In many ways, we see through polling that support for cash assistance broadly has increased. We don't know precisely how much, and we don't know that it's yet at the scale of, you know, let's say people's support for taxing the rich, which is overwhelming, but still doesn't necessarily translate to action on that front. But we do see that the child tax credit pointed in some of the things that Clarence was mentioning to the very case for cash in the first place. We had a program that in theory would lift 40%, reduce child poverty by 40%. Now, that only could happen if everybody who was eligible received the credit. The fact that they introduced a non-filer portal was incredible and new to many communities. People are not used to the IRS giving out money. They're used to going and submitting forms and being kind of scared that they're going to get audited and maybe, you know, something seized from them. And that trust in government and that expectation of government to provide no strings attached support that gives you the dignity to spend on what you need is new. And I think the child tax credit is only beginning to transform folks' expectations of the social safety net and the degree to which it can be unconditional and unrestricted. But the administrative burden attached to, you know, working through the tax system is still an ongoing issue, even in state level programs where you have large pilots that everybody's aware about and have managed to get the political support to pass into policy. Let's say even Illinois, for example, where Cook County's pilot is turning into a policy. You know, you still have both a lack of awareness and a challenge with the implementation in reducing that administrative burden, which just points back to what motivated a lot of folks in the guaranteed income space to advocate for it in the first place, which is, you know, ensuring that the social safety net is not by design excluding or hampering the people it's meant to help. And a lot of this relies on the long-term legacy of safety net reform from the 90s that I know Peter Edelman here could say a lot about, having left the Clinton administration after welfare reform was passed. And that's partially because that welfare reform turned a program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children into a state block grant, which in theory still provides some form of income support in some states, but is highly targeted. So in some states, as soon as you make upwards of $4,800, you're off the program, and it wasn't a lot of help to begin with. So imagine going through the process of enrolling in a program that's so limited and won't be relied upon as soon as you get $1 over the income limit. That program was turned into temporary assistance to needy families, and that whittled down the infrastructure of this direct form of cash support from at the federal level, implemented through the states. Now, that reform was predicated on really cynical and frankly racist narratives around people in poverty and who was poor. So much so that we still say the word poor and poverty, and folks' mental models around that are highly racialized. And that becomes a barrier to promoting a policy that targets poverty. When it came to the stimulus checks, obviously the two different party administrations implemented stimulus checks during the pandemic. And there was support for cash, but that cash went way up the income scale. And as we know, so did the child tax credit to some degree, maybe not to the same degree, a little bit lower income thresholds. But you have this sort of contingent of middle class families who also saw that it received this support and expectation. And it's sort of this problem of like, who is the constituency that guaranteed income or these programs is serving? And is that constituency large enough to push for the policy to be permanent? Or is that constituency so targeted that all of the racist narratives around poverty come up and create opposition for those programs? There's another point on that I'm losing the train of thought on. Guaranteed income, as we define it at the Jain Family Institute, is a broad category of cash assistance that's unconditional and regular. So people can rely on it coming again and again, which has very different impacts than a one-time payment that you don't know will ever come again. The specific design parameters of a guaranteed income can mean that you implement it widely and then pull it back at higher income levels in order to prevent the administrative burden from reducing uptake at the point of the implementation. For many folks in the guaranteed income space, that's the bigger difference between a universal policy and a guaranteed income. You could implement it universally in order to reduce the administrative burden so that you don't miss people who need it. And then through the process of taxation, almost similar to the non-filer portal, which relied on last year's data, at the point of filing your taxes, you can take it back from people who don't need it, or through progressive taxation, it's automatically taken back. These are questions of design, but they have major implications for take-up and equity for the issue. And then they also have implications for the broader political support for these programs, so that you have all of the right constituencies advocating that this is their right to a cash support and a safety net for household level shocks.
That's such an important point, Halah, and thank you for noting that sometimes there is a real political advantage if you're advancing this bill to make it more broadly available on a universal basis than on a more narrow one. And that's an unfortunate reality in our society, that folks are not always committed to helping the folks most in need. But thank you so much for making that point. Jeremy?
Yeah, so again, just sort of building on that point, I think there was a famous bank robber who was asked why he robbed banks and said, well, that's where the money is. Yeah, we sort of look at this as thinking about where the money is and obviously how do we get it for the people we'd like to get it for. And just in very broad strokes, I feel like when it comes to policy like this, especially when you want to see it happen on a big, large scale level, there's really two ways to do it. One, you can say, the government is going to establish a program and spend a bunch of money that it will raise in some way, ideally, certainly through progressive taxation or some other way. And then the other way is sort of through the tax code. And you might say, well, that's really the same thing, is, it's really no different if the government raises a certain amount of money or declines to collect from people a certain amount of money. But I think the reality is just, again, as we start to think about narratives and how we create support for these programs, that, people see the loss of revenue to government through things like tax cuts as potentially more palatable than raising money to then be spent on a new government program. So, for my money, that's one way that the tax code, even recognizing the difficult history of the IRS and thinking through that bureaucracy, points towards using the tax code at the state and federal levels. We had, and they only did it when we were right on the verge of passing it. So we had a bunch of Republicans supporting an increase in the earned income tax credit, which is a slightly different tax credit meant for working families when we expanded that in our state last year. And I think we may have some who support the child tax credit. They're coming at it from the lens of supporting essentially tax cuts for families. And that's how we talk about it with them. That's not how we talk about it with the progressive caucus of our state legislature, where we're talking about, using the tax code as a pathway to prove that Illinois can essentially provide a guaranteed income, and then being able to take those learnings to the federal level and talk about it here in DC. So I think to some extent, the sort of framing question, as always, depends on your audience and who you're trying to convince to get something done. And we've, I think, found some success with a different ways of talking about this issue with different people.
Jeremy, that's such a, I think, really useful practical point about presenting the same policy in slightly different ways to different audiences, or maybe not so slightly. Another tool that I think for anyone who's working to try to advance guaranteed income policy in your state legislatures is to know that the American Bar Association in 2019 actually adopted a policy to support the human right to basic income through any government, federal down to local governments and tribal governments. That policy is actually available in the materials for this conference, which is going to be available on the Civil Rights and Social Justice website if it isn't already. And you can get to that website just through ambar.org/CRSJ. ABA policy can often be used literally as a part of your packet of materials that you take to state legislative offices and show them that there is support for policy of this kind. I'm going to pivot a little bit away from the child tax credit policy to focus on the role of lawyers in both advancing guaranteed income programs and ensuring implementation for those who are eligible in the way that the programs are structured. And Jeremy, I'm going to ask you, what are some of the things that you're seeing in Illinois in terms of where lawyers' assistance would be most helpful?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And And I think we've heard a little bit of the answer to this so far, right? Clarence described sort of, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, and then there was all this implementation work to be done by federal agencies and folks like Clarence. And you better believe every time a federal agency is setting up one of these programs, a lot of lawyers are figuring out how to get that program set up and how to make it work and how to, take really practical policy intentions like the recognition that we need to, set up this free filer tax portal at the IRS. Well, you can't just, turns out, walk over to the IRS and say, like, IRS, will you set up this portal? And even if they say yes, there are all sorts of legal implications from, data privacy to, figuring out how different agencies can or can't share information between them based on existing federal laws. Just lots of things that you have to work through before you can actually implement a policy that everybody agrees on and wants to implement. So that's sort of one part of the process. We've found as our city, county, and state have implemented guaranteed income programs, they're almost constantly sort of coming to us as attorneys and saying, like, we know what we want to do. Like, can you make sure we can actually legally do this, or can you walk us through the steps that will actually take us to implement that without running afoul of some law that we're not even thinking about that maybe isn't even directly related to guaranteed income. Another critical piece on the guaranteed income front. So when we think about guaranteed income, our goal is with our pilot programs and eventually with more permanent programs, we want to supplant people's incomes or to supplement people's incomes, not to supplant them. We're not doing any good for a family if we are providing them with cash assistance on a monthly basis, and that causes them to lose their food assistance, their SNAP benefits, or their health care coverage through Medicaid, or any other public benefit that they may be receiving. So, again, that involves sort of a thicket of federal and state rules and policies to try to make sure that we're doing everything we can to do what, I think in the field we sort of call benefits protection, making sure that folks keep as many benefits as they can. And we cannot do that, as it turns out, in every single instance and with every single program and for every single dollar. But it does turn out that there's a lot we can do both through our state governments and by working with the federal government to make sure that laws and policies are interpreted, again, by attorneys in ways that make it most favorable so that we can protect as many benefits as possible. And so we're, for example, working with a team of attorneys who are considering, what is the right approach to make to the federal government to try to get some consistent policy between federal agencies around how, and these are agencies that administer various public benefit programs, to figure out how they will treat income received from guaranteed income programs. There's not a lot of consistency right now between federal agencies. Every program has very different rules about what it considers income, what it can exempt from income, those sorts of things. So, it's going to be a bunch of attorneys who sort of draft a request to the Domestic Policy Council to say, can we get some consistent federal policy? Can it be good policy? And, can it work across agencies to help folks who are receiving benefits protect their programs? Lawyers, of course, are always, I think when we pull ourselves out of sort of the absolute weeds, very, very good lobbyists. We persuade people for a living. Hopefully, that's kind of the job of an attorney. I think folks from my office and other attorneys have been very, very good and successful lobbyists for a lot of these programs. And then probably, the last thing I'll say is just more around the sort of local implementation. We were able to kind of piggybacking on some of the work that Clarence did. Some organizations in Illinois, when child tax credit payments and stimulus checks were available, set up a website called Get My Payment Illinois, and recruited a bunch of attorneys to sort of be the behind the scenes response voice on that website. So families could, folks who are having trouble getting their payments could, contact that website and either just get a question answered, like, I heard there was this IRS website, where do I find it? Like that was a simpler question. Harder questions, like, I have 3 kids, but 2 of them live with me, and one of them lives with a former partner, and they live with me part of the year, but not the full year. Do I qualify for the credit? Do I get the full credit? Can I only get part of it? We were able to have legal aid and legal services and other attorneys available to answer a lot of those questions for families.
Jeremy, thank you so much for that. And we had a question from the Zoom about the top 3 things lawyers can do. So not to put too fine a point on it, but I'm just going to summarize what you just said. Lawyers can help with implementation of the actual guaranteed income programs and making sure that they don't run afoul of local, state, and federal laws. They can help to pass guaranteed income programs, and they can also provide representation to folks who are seeking to apply for guaranteed income programs and make sure that they're able to get those benefits that are available to them. Clarence, did you want to jump in here? Right. Okay.
Not a
Yeah,
lawyer.
absolutely. So I'm going
Great, they
to,
were
wonderful.
helpful.
Yeah.
I want to jump in just
yeah.
quickly to say, speaking of the role of lawyers, Antonia led the campaign to introduce the basic income resolution for the ABA. So I really think we should give her a round of applause for that.
A team effort for sure, but thank you. That's very kind. So we're going to go ahead and open it up for more questions from the audience, if you have any for our esteemed panelists. Right now.
Thank you. In addition to looking at implementation of guaranteed income programs, I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to look at the programs themselves and how they're framed. It seems like everything is around population as opposed to situation or people's needs. And just wondering if this is an opportunity to look at whether we should have programs that are that finely defined, like with child tax credit, great program, but if you're not part of that group, then you have to figure out how to get some sort of resources similar to that where you fit in. And every federal program seems to be around a specific population. So I'm just wondering, how does the population politics interfere with the ability to actually get guaranteed income programs implemented, and how is that an opportunity to change some of these programs and how they deal with getting assistance or getting people what they need from an income perspective?
Who would like to take that up?
I can speak to that first, maybe. So one of the things that I've personally been pushing for in all of the dozens of pilots that I've talked to across the country as they've started to figure out, okay, how do I fund this? How do I implement it? What does it look like? How should we measure people's material hardships so that we know if they qualify? All of these big questions, is to also ask the question of how are you framing the program to the participants, and what is the impact of that framing on them and on the surrounding community that's hearing about this program? Can you do, robust survey work in the community to understand public perceptions, because what you'll pick up on is public perceptions of poverty, public perceptions of social assistance, public perceptions of government, and ways in which program framing can sort of shift that to some extent. It's also really important that the program's framing reflects the values of that community related to that program. When we implemented the program in Compton, it was very important that we emphasized that this was a program that was targeting racial equity. And that was an ask that came from all of the community leaders who said, sure, we want this program, we want guaranteed income, but we want to make sure that it's clear that this is part of a bigger agenda around racial equity in our community, and moving resources directly to the community rather than towards, for example, policing of our community. So that was a really big emphasis. And I think we know from some research, both in the United States and abroad, that framing can have an impact on also how people spend the money, how they relate to the program. There was a study, you have a question how much you can extrapolate from an international context, but there was a study of a cash transfer implemented by Give Directly in Kenya that found that if you framed the cash assistance program as community empowerment, there were different effects on how people spent the money. People also spent it in their communities. There were spillover effects on non-participants. People were sharing resources. You can see some of the ways that this might happen. Now, there's also an emphasis within the guaranteed income community to focus on people who need the money, which makes sense for a lot of folks. It makes sense politically because there's a lot more support in all sorts of polling for cash assistance that targets people who need it most. But there is a big question around how that allows people to relate to the program themselves, the level of shame. And I 2 weeks ago was in Texas, where there's a guaranteed income program being implemented in Austin, the progressive haven maybe of Texas. But what was really interesting to hear from folks around the social safety nets there is that even people who are advocates for robust social safety nets grapple with this persistent and cultural and community-wide shame associated with accessing those benefits. And it's a big challenge in implementing even their rental assistance programs and all sorts of other programs to help people access them. They have to think carefully about the framing. And that's one of the things that I think guaranteed income pilots are really trying to challenge. And it's the next frontier for sure. When we say pilots to policy, I think the really big emphasis that maybe we haven't touched on so much is that pilots need to be a context for organizing. The child tax credit didn't continue, not because it wasn't helping tons of people, but because it happened so fast that people were barely even aware it was happening, much less able to organize to advocate for it as their issue. And that's not to say there wasn't robust advocacy. I'm looking around and there was a ton of CTC advocates in the room that I'm really glad to see and did a behemoth of work around the clock to push for the CTC. But at the community level, did people have ownership of this policy as an entitlement? That's the long arc of work in organizing to make sure that people understand this is a policy solution that is viable and that meets their urgent needs.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to jump on this, I'm stealing on my good lines from other people today, but a colleague of mine said the other day, I think narrative eats policy for breakfast. Like the narrative around these issues is all important, right? Folks at the community level will be very, very concerned about how somebody might spend $500 in cash assistance. I'm not at all concerned about how I spend the money I received from the mortgage interest deduction because I'm a homeowner. And that was more than $500 that I got from that last year, quite a bit more. I think to build on the last point, Halah is exactly right, that the CTC was just such a blip on the radar despite its overwhelming importance that, yeah, so many folks who realized it or who got assistance did not even realize that, they were getting assistance under this expanded program, that there was a need to continue fighting for it. And quite frankly, organizing takes time, even under the best of circumstances. So trying to be able to bring people together to organize in sort of a 9-month period is an extremely challenging thing to do, even for folks really trying to do it. Just to sort of show the different narratives around this issue. One piece of legislation we're working on at the state level is just a very basic piece of legislation to just direct all of our state agencies in Illinois to do what we're also asking the federal government to do, which is take all steps that they can do to make sure that benefits are protected for people. So it's a piece of legislation that doesn't cost any money and just, ask some state agencies to do certain things. And, I went and testified at a committee hearing, and Democrats in talking about this in the committee hearing were like, this is really just a way to make sure that, within the rules that are out there, the state streamlines the ways it provides the assistance in the most effective way for families. And a couple of Republicans were like, sounds to me like you're saying the people getting the free money are getting a benefit that hardworking folks who make income, through different sources like work aren't getting. So framing is really everything. Thankfully, we have more people who bought into the first of those framings than the last, but we're not immune to the second one, and quite frankly, not always just from Republicans.
Speaking of framing, we have a question that I think is seeking a clarification about the structure of guaranteed income programs that came in through Zoom. So I'm just going to read the question. Is the guaranteed income program specifically for Black and Brown women or available to all women who share the same economic conditions when residing in the same niche community or market area? Someone like to clarify what we're talking about?
So guaranteed income, as we define it, is any regular and unconditional cash assistance program. There are guaranteed income pilots across the country that have targeted different groups, and certainly including, people at low incomes or with facing material hardship across every race, ethnic, and immigrant background. You do see programs serving really everybody across the country, but I think it's really important to know that there's a strong impetus in the guaranteed income community to use guaranteed income as a one of many mechanisms to address racial inequity and historic exclusion from social programs, and that's both intentional exclusion from social programs and sort of systemic inequality inherent to implementation and the communities that are reached by social services. So it's a mixed picture, but not referring to any guaranteed income pilot in particular. Folks are targeting across middle to lowest income levels and various subgroups.
And I thought you spoke to this earlier so beautifully, Halah, but I want to lift it up again, that you said that the guaranteed income programs, particularly the more successful ones, are really looking at the needs in particular communities and responding to those as they are structured. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll take another question from the audience, but Jeremy, you wanted to get in here.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't, if the question was maybe referring to the program that Aisha was talking about on the last panel, that program was, in fact, I think, targeted towards Black women in Texas, Mississippi.
Okay. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ariana Guzman. I work for the U.S. Probation Office in Puerto Rico. I'm also an attorney. My question goes, how do you measure that the money that is addressed for those specific needs is actually used for that? Because in Puerto Rico, we have the problem that most of the money that actually came from all that help from COVID and the Recovery Act, many people use it for what it was supposed to be used, but many didn't. And in a way, it impacts how that money is used to really address the needs of the people and that economic hardship. So how do you measure that in terms of the program that is being used for what it's supposed to be to address those needs?
Yeah, so I may push back a little bit against the premise of your question. What is it supposed to be used for? In my view, and I think my organization's view and the view of most folks in this movement, there's a real feeling and deep belief, and I certainly share it, that if you give families money, they understand how they need to use it to best meet the needs of their families. And so in my view, there's really not a lot of room for the sort of conversation on, what was it meant to be used for? I think folks know what they need money for, and they need what they need to spend money on, and they'll spend funds that they receive for those purposes. There are folks out there who will say folks are getting food assistance, why did they decide to spend $20 of their food assistance on a steak once a month when they could have used that money more efficiently and bought a huge, enormous bag of rice and beans? I think, frankly, family wants to use their SNAP benefits once a month to buy steak because that's something that they feel is good for them and their family. They should be able to do that. I don't spend a lot of time, to be honest, worrying about how people are using the funds they receive from guaranteed income programs. I think people are, by and large, using it to meet the needs of their family and doing that very effectively.
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you all so much for all of this. This is incredible. I would love to unpack a little bit the term families and why we keep saying families. So what does that say about who is deserving of direct cash assistance or guaranteed income? And then how can federal legislation on the child tax credit address poverty among children and then also support the root causes of why having children in this country means you're more likely to become poor? So both why families, why framing it as families are deserving, and then also how do we support families in the mechanisms of what makes families more likely to become poor?
Who would like to take that or take one of those? Yeah.
I don't know about this. Maybe I'll defer to somebody else on the second part. The first part, I think, CTC is, you have to, almost by definition, however you define family, right? But you have to have a dependent in this case, right, to receive the credit. So I think there it's just, it is, it is what it is. I think, some of the guaranteed income programs, I'd imagine, and, others who are familiar with kind of, we talked earlier, there are hundreds of pilots at this point. I think there are, I think a significant number, again, are focused on families, to your point, or folks who have children. But I think there's quite a few, we talked to, earlier, and I know of some, right, who are, focused on individuals who, recently incarcerated, right, returning to their communities. I think there are, I think families, to maybe the second point, right, I think these programs are generally targeting those who are in hardship, have the most need. Unfortunately, to your point, right, it is often families, given the cost of living in many of the communities around the country that are most in need. And I think with limited resources, which almost all of these guaranteed income programs and pilots are working off of, a question is how do we design, and what questions are we trying to answer around support for those who are most in need. And I think, the decision has been made in many cases, kind of gating on, children or dependents of some sort.
Yeah, I will say at the state level in Illinois, we kind of have I would call it a 3-year plan, but that's a little bit ambitious. So I might say a 3-phase plan. Phase 1, sort of in thinking through tax policy, was the earned income credit, which doesn't require having dependents, does require work. Phase 2 we're working on now is sort of the child tax credit. Phase 3 that we're thinking about is, that's something that doesn't exist, but thinking about how to ensure that, to your point, folks who may not have income from work, but also would not need to have children, are receiving cash assistance. And part of this too, and a piece we haven't quite touched on, is also what we define and think about as work. So many people in this country are doing very important unpaid work that we don't define as work because it's unpaid. Care work for young children, care for parents, or for disabled adult family members, right? And that is sort of defined as not work because it isn't outside the home and nobody's getting paid for it. But they're doing that work. It's very important work. It takes up inordinate amounts of time and is extremely difficult from a mental and sometimes physical health standpoint. And we need to find more and more ways in our public policy to recognize that and to actually make sure that people are paid in some way for doing that work.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hello there. Briefly mentioned a moment ago was the sort of intersection of criminal justice and guaranteed basic income. Wondering if if you guys could just comment on the relationship between guaranteed basic income and potential taxpayer savings on the cost of incarceration, which we know can be like $50,000, $60,000 per person, and sort of the role of recidivism or reducing incarceration, particularly among youth who are at risk.
So, I don't have specific numbers for you on like that particular kind of equation, but it's a great point, and I think on almost all these programs, you can look at and the studies have been done, like the ROI is fantastic, right? Like $1 invested, will save the taxpayer, $8, right? For many of these programs. I think looking at the particular context, I was recently talking with this organization, Fasanelli, that does workforce development, often working with formerly incarcerated individuals. And they did kind of an analysis of those who were in their program that were on some sort of public benefits, use that to support their time in the workforce program, got a job, over time moved off of those benefits. And, we're able to kind of very clearly show, we've seen this I go back to Mayor Tubbs and Stockton, both on the guaranteed income, but you all may be familiar with some of the work that he did there with Advanced Peace and the Community Violence Interrupters or intervention programs, right? It was fairly controversial because a key component of that was providing monthly stipends to individuals kind of in that, serving in that, or they would call them fellows, individuals who were fellows in that program. And you saw both long-term effects for those individuals, staying out of prison, but you also saw kind of these great community effects as well, like safety, crime, crime went down, safety was improved. And so you have the ROI on a few different levels there, kind of even within that, and just, maybe it wasn't the exact point you were making, but within that, we still have you would think that would be a program to be celebrated kind of in that community and the folks would really want to support, but the pushback there was really tough around these individuals aren't worthy of the dollars that are being invested in them. And so it's a great question on this, and that's kind of one of the key arguments for a lot of these. I think Peggy mentioned in the last panel, right? It's not just, you're putting money into these programs and still doing all these other things you could do, but there's a case to be made that, hey, there's more efficient ways, and these programs are much more efficient ways of giving folks the resources that they need, and that we're reducing the pressure on other parts of the public welfare infrastructure, inclusive of the prison system.
I think a lot of folks are asking this question in the guaranteed income space of how do we, think about guaranteed income and safety. There's this broader sort of definition of economic security and financial security. When we think about safety in our communities and reduction of small crime, I won't be the best expert on the topic, but it's a really crucial question to address, to say, like, investing in people's financial and economic security has knock-on effects on public safety and individual safety, and can be measured in a way that reflects the cost savings overall in many directions, but including in the space of criminal justice and the cost of incarceration when we treat poverty as a crime, and as a source of a lot of breakdown in general security across communities. But I think that both of these questions kind of get at a bigger issue within guaranteed income, which is, what is it trying to solve? When we think about the policy options that guaranteed income is sort of being presented in, we've got one, which is the CTC, and that is a family-specific, child-specific guaranteed income program. But there are also other versions that we could think of that are beyond just parents, because parents are not the only ones facing financial precarity in the country. And that's sort of where the next phase of defining policy design from the pilots is going. The thing about guaranteed income is that it is a solution-driven, guaranteed income advocacy is a solution-driven campaign, not a problem-driven campaign, which makes it very different. We think of guaranteed income as a solution to many problems. Worker precarity, maybe people have more bargaining power because they have a fallback option. Helping people in the case of emergency on top of insurance, for example, or in ways that insurance can't provide. But guaranteed income is not a panacea, and it can't plug into everything in the same ways, particularly at the scales that it's being implemented. I mean, you've got even $300 a month to one parent is still $300 a month. In some pilots, a lot even smaller than that. But the other question that you are getting at is, how do you measure the larger impacts of guaranteed income? And that's a really important question for the collective data that's coming out of all of these pilots. One of the things that I'm kind of is my hobby horse is thinking about the long-term discount rate for policy analysts and maybe econ folks in the room. What is the right discount rate that shows the cost savings from investing at the forefront of the problem and reducing precarity that you can measure against the counterfactual cost of dealing with the problems associated with persistent poverty in the long run. So that's a long-term question, and I hope that it'll address issues of criminal justice as well, but that's the work of researchers.
Fantastic. Well, we are going to leave it there. I want to thank my esteemed panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. Dr. Clarence Wardell, Halah Ahmad, and Jeremy Rosen. Thank you so much. I should also say we were so grateful to have Amy Castro in the planning of this panel, but she also fell ill last night and was unable to be here. I encourage you all to look at her Center for Guaranteed Research at the University of Pennsylvania. There's fantastic data there as well, and I know she really wanted to be here. We tried to incorporate many of her points in our comments, and thank you to my panelists for doing that. Thank you so much.